So I never know how much time I'm going to have to teach on this Sukkot, which is filled with so many things going on. And so for some of you, you'll think, oh, terrific, he's going to be short. And for probably no one other than my mom, you'll wish I was longer. So we're going to err on the shorter side. But let's open to page 427 in the Siddur, because I thought that I would just give some reflections on Kohelet, and it could accordion out or in. That's up to you guys. But first I want to read Ecclesiastes chapter 3, this very famous chapter, this very famous part, probably because the birds put it to music, and I actually spoke about it a little bit on Yom Kippur. But a season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven. I'm going to ask you, what are the big kind of takeaways from this? And then we're going to contrast it with another text. So think about that. What's the big takeaway? A time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sowing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. One of those verses are actually what's on the cover of the Torah cover that the Chazan pointed out, right? Va'as safod, va'al rakud, right? That there's a time for wailing, a time for weeping, and a time for dancing. And that is on the cover, I think beautifully appropriate. What are some of the big ideas that we take from this? Yeah, Sarah. So a time for rebuilding makes you think of the kibbutzim. Absolutely. There'll be a time for rebuilding. Yeah. Yes. Life is a balance, meaning what? The life is all of these things. And hopefully it's in balance, but that at any given moment it may feel out of balance. But that what brings it back into balance is that there's also the opposite. So our joy maybe is tempered a little bit, but also our depression at moments, meaning that we always know that there's the other side of the coin or something. Other ideas? Thank you. Other ideas. Alan, and then Adam.
Nothing lasts forever. You may be in a situation where you think this is it, my life is terrible, it's going to stay terrible forever, but there's a season.
Right, nothing lasts forever, Alan says. There's a season for everything. So a bad moment isn't going to last. And so it's actually sort of hopeful to have that perspective, especially when there is so much bad. Right? And Adam.
I can't help but think ripping versus sewing. When I think of ripping, I think of ripping in the sense of at a funeral.
So he's saying ripping compared to sewing. Ripping like kriya at a funeral compared to sewing or mending, which say something more about that on the upswing of it. Yeah, it's interesting that are those ripping and mending, when you mend something, it's still there. Like you know that it was torn. It's not perfect as it was before. I think that's an interesting insight as well. Right? When it's a time to build or to sow, or right, that you're not erasing what happened in the first part of the verse, right? And yet we're continuing forward. So I want to contrast this. Here we are. I want to contrast this with a poem by Yehuda Amichai. A man doesn't have time in his life, is at least the English translation of the title of this Yehuda Amichai poem. So I'll read it slowly so that we can kind of absorb what it is. And again, the same question, what's the big idea that Amichai is clearly reflecting on Kohelet, but what is he trying to bring to the conversation? A man doesn't have time in his life to have time for everything. He doesn't have seasons enough to have a season for every purpose. Ecclesiastes was wrong about that. A man needs to love and to hate at the same moment, to laugh and cry with the same eyes, with the same hands to throw stones and to gather them, to make love in war and war in love, and to hate and forgive and remember and forget, to arrange and confuse, to eat and to digest what history takes years and years to do. A man doesn't have time. When he loses, he seeks. When he finds, he forgets. When he forgets, he loves. When he loves, he begins to forget. And his soul is seasoned. His soul is very professional. Only his body remains forever an amateur. It tries and it misses, gets muddled, doesn't learn a thing, drunk and blind in its pleasures and its pains. He will die as figs die in autumn, shriveled and full of himself and sweet, the leaves growing dry on the ground, the bare branches pointing to the place where there's time for everything. So I know it is hard when you hear a poem sometimes to capture it all, but what are you taking? What do you think his point is? This is when, as a teacher, I can be patient. Life is short. Okay. Anything more? Nope. Okay. Life is short, just like your comment. So excellent, more. Toby and Suzanne.
That you need to find meaning in every moment and not wait for a later moment to reflect the meaning back, because you may not get that later moment.
Yeah, Toby says that you need to find meaning in the moment and not wait for the next moment to come as we start forgetting what that was. And Suzanne. In the reality, we live in the dichotomy. That is, life is not as clean or as bifurcated as Kohelet would suggest. What Amichai is saying is that, no, we actually are living in both of these moments simultaneously. Maybe one is turned up to level 8 and one is turned up to level 2, but that we have this sense of both of these things happening, and not to wait for it to change, to flip over to the other side. Yeah, Josh.
I wonder if he's questioning the collective mobilization, which if you look at the original text, it has the idea that we have to do these things together, that we move on together.
Yeah, that the idea is that we maybe saying that we have to be as a community, as the collective, all together in these moments. And within the collective, within the community, within the country, within the people, all of these things are going to be experienced. Not by the individual, but by everyone together. So which of these two resonate in your life experience? The Kohelet, where it is either one or the other, or the Amichai, where it is much more confused, much more integrated. Jackie.
You can't wait for better times to find happiness. You have to find happiness every day. Look for it. Sometimes you have to look harder than other times.
You can't wait
You can't wait.
to find happiness, that you have to declare it in in the moment. And of course, within Sukkot, it's Zman Simchatenu, even within the fragility. Yeah. And a last comment. Todd. Yeah, Todd says that he experiences it kind of post October 7th, any bit of joy, which still exists in bountiful measures in the world, but it is tempered by the feeling of the reality, and that both somehow we have to live in both, right? So here we are, we're having this amazing celebration of these amazing B'nai Mitzvah, right? And somehow also we're remembered that the hostages still remain in our hearts, and soldiers serving right now, including friends, are still in our hearts. And so both of these happen. So I guess Kohelet was right, but incomplete. Right? And Amichai is bringing that forward for us. I agree that the Yehuda Amichai reflects more of my lived experience, that there's a continuous point of joy, which does exist. We cannot forget that. And also the hardship of living, especially now. So thank you for thinking about Kohelet, and also beyond Kohelet as well. Shabbat Shalom.